Hi everybody, this is my 40-gallon Waterfall tank, and today we are going to take a trip around the world. I got a lot on my plate as far as videos that I want to shoot, and I realized today it's been 2 weeks since we've taken a trip around the world, so we're going to go ahead and do that today, and then I can worry about shooting the rest of those videos later on. Everybody get the whole weekend to work their way through this video because it's probably going to be another fairly long one. We got a lot to go over. So let's get right to it. My waterfall tank, not a lot to talk about. I did add some new fish, and we will get to them in a few minutes. But I also threw some additives in this tank. I threw some crushed up eggshells. I threw some of them up top in this basin here. I threw some of them up top in that basin there. And I threw some just across the back of the tank. And they'll just sift down into the gravel and substrate, and you won't be able to even tell they're in there. In fact, if I hadn't told you about them, you probably wouldn't be able to tell they're in there, and you still really can't. If you look way in the back, you can see some light colored areas. That's because there's still some visible eggshell lying on top of it, but that's about it. Anyway, we're going to talk more about the eggshells and why I use them as an additive in my tanks in an upcoming video. That's one of the things I want to talk about. So there's a little teaser for you. There is a reason I use eggshells specifically. I think they're really, really good stuff. There's my little Princess Sassafras coming in to not really say hello. She's a very aloof kitty. She never really even lets me pet her or get close to her. If I even try, she just kind of runs out of my reach. But she's always just kind of close to me. So she watches what I do, but she doesn't ever really let me pet her that much. It's a strange relationship. But she's a sweet kitty, so there you go. That was little Princess Sassafras. Anyway, back to the topic at hand is my water chemistry. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about why I use the eggshell specifically, and so on and so forth. I got a few other things that I use in different circumstances, and again, that's going to be some upcoming video. But I have been putting it in this tank. It has brought my pH up a little bit, and it has brought my general hardness up a little bit as well, and that's good for all of the guppies I've got in here. I've also got a new live bearer in here. You can actually see it right there. That beautiful black and blue. It's just a high fin platy is what I bought it under, but the coloration on it is just fantastic. It's this sort of iridescent blue with the black sort of smoky fins on it, and you can see it in there munching away at the algae that's growing on the wood there. Live bearers are always good algae eaters, and of course all these little guppies in here do the same thing all throughout the livelong day. So I got the new blue guppies. There's one right there. There's the other one down here. We just saw it swim by. So I got two of those. I bought 3 of them, but one of them vanished. I don't know where it went. It should have been in my 29 miscellaneous, but I never saw it again. So I don't know whatever happened to that one. So there's the 2 blue ones, and then the other new fish in this tank are these Buenos Aires tetras. And I have to say, when I first put them in the tank, they schooled really tightly, and I was really happy about that. I love watching them swim around like as a single unit like that. But over time, they've been in the tank for a little while now. They've gotten a lot more relaxed and comfortable, and there's a lot of activity in the tank. And so they break up and swim around individually a lot. I've heard that they're going to destroy all my plants in the tank. The only thing I've seen them doing with the plants so far is I saw one of them swimming around with a piece of duckweed in its mouth. The same way a dog might walk around with its favorite toy in its mouth, this fish was swimming around with a piece of duckweed hanging out of its mouth. So they are welcome to eat all the duckweed they want. So far, I haven't seen them bothering any of the other plants. And lastly, the final fish that I have in this tank that is a new one is a little tiny bristlenose pleco, and I did actually see it last night on the Java fern right there. That's Java Windelov. It's got those little sort of fingery ends on it. And I saw it rooting around in there, and while I was looking at it, one of the guppies swam up and started pecking at it and harassing it, and it sort of made its way deeper down into the fern, and I've not seen it since. But it's a tiny little fish. It's smaller than the guppies, and they're either endlers or they're endlers hybrids. I know these blue ones are endlers because I just bought them. All the other ones in the tank are just hybrid fish that have come out of my tanks that breed. And so again, I don't know whether they're true guppies, true endlers, somewhere in between or whatever. Doesn't really matter. But they're bigger than the little bristlenose pleco that's in the tank. So it's probably going to be a while before we start seeing that one on any kind of regular basis. Other than that, I don't think we got anything else to talk about in this tank. Not really much to talk about in my foot tank either. Everybody's still doing okay in there. I did count the other day. We still have 3 big full-grown ghost shrimp that I know of. There could be more in there that I didn't spot, but I did spot at least 3 of them. My cherry barb is still in there doing well, and there's some guppies swimming around in there. So again, everything is just ticking over as usual. So let's get our lights turned out on this tank. That will reduce the glare on the other tanks throughout the rest of the video. That is the light that I keep on for my sort of sunset appearance when we have the quiet time at the end of the day. So we're going to start here at my 29 Miscellaneous and work our way around from here. So this tank has got some new fish and some plants have been removed. Some of the new fish you can see right there in the middle. Those red and blue Colombian tetras. I'm really happy with them so far. Really pretty fish. This is not one of my more brightly lit tanks, and it doesn't have very high quality lighting in it. It was one of those starter kits you can buy at Walmart. It's a 29. It's got the lid that came with it, and on it came these little LEDs. So not super powerful, not super high quality lighting. And as such, now there you can see my other new fish in the tank, and they all think they're going to get fed. This angelfish goes nuts when I put food in there. Really aggressive feeder, so that's a good sign. You can see how fat it is already. It's probably going to grow up to be a nice big healthy fish, and if I'm any judge of angelfish, that's going to be a looker when it grows up. That is going to be a beautiful fish. Well, I mean, it already is, but when that thing's full grown, absolutely fantastic. I'm really excited about that one. So that's the other new fish that goes in there. The lighting for that one isn't going to make that big of a difference with that sort of smoky, dark appearance. But these Colombian tetras, these red-blue Colombian tetras, are gorgeous. They've got all this sort of iridescent color to them, and the reds and the blues. I'd really like to see that pop underneath of a higher quality light. So I might get more of those and put them in a different tank that does have better lighting on it. In the meantime, they look really good in here. Otherwise, still ticking over like a clock, no issues. You can see my clown pleco hiding on the glass behind the filter intake there. And you can see that bright white chopped off end where I removed a big chunk of Anubias recently. But other than that, haven't done anything with this tank, and everything's still ticking over fine. I also put the last remaining Rasbora het that was in my 40 breeder. I scooped it out of there and put it in this tank so it can live out its final days here. It's a few years old now, so it might have a few years left in it. Who knows? Moving on to my 55-gallon Gourami tank. Looks like we got a lot going on in this tank, but we don't really. I put the air stone in there for 2 reasons. One, I believed I had green algae growing all over the surface. I had this green scum that was growing on the surface, and it really looked like algae. And I thought maybe putting a nice vigorous air stone in there would break up the algae on the surface with the surface agitation, and I wanted to see if that would just eliminate the algae altogether. I also decided that, hey, since I got the air stone in there, I may as well do a chemi-clean treatment, because you can see how much cyanobacteria I've got all over everything. All that sort of green growth on the ends of that fern, that's all cyanobacteria growing in there. And then, of course, all that purpley orange stuff that you see in this tank that, well, it comes across as purple. It's more of like a rusty orange color to my eye. But all that's red cyanobacteria. So, you know, this tank could use a chemi-clean treatment. And since I got the air stone in there, why not do that? So first of all, I only had a little bit of chemi-clean left, so I only did about a quarter of the amount that I would have done for a normal treatment, and yet I still got a pretty significant result. If you can look at all the stuff that's on that rock, look how dead all that growth and everything is. Look how dead all the growth on this rock is. You can see how much bubbles and stuff are collected on the back. I'm not sure if that's algae growing on the glass or if that's cyanobacteria. The green cyanobacteria doesn't seem to be as affected. You can see all this. It's definitely being impacted by it, but it's not as killed off as, again, when we look over here, look at what's going on that woodwork. All that stuff is really dying back and looking gross. And that's from a small dose of this ChemiClean, about a quarter of what I would have put in there if I had a full container of this stuff. So I find that to be interesting. Secondly, pay no attention to that floating fern that's supposed to be tucked down under this piece of rock, but it got knocked loose, and I'll get to that whenever I get to it. That's not really meant to be floating like that. But that scum that I had growing on the surface vanished when I started doing the ChemiClean treatment. So I'm beginning to think that maybe that was not algae on the surface, but maybe that was also green cyanobacteria growing on the surface. It's certainly not out of the question. So I've ordered more ChemiClean. It'll be here Monday. I got all kinds of stuff coming on Monday. I've got some Dr. Tim's ammonium chloride. So there's a little teaser for you. We're going to be doing some experiment and testing on that. I'm still having issues with my rapid cycling experiment that I've been doing. I'm getting really weird results again that I don't understand. So that's another one of these videos that I want to be talking about here in the next week or so coming up. But again, I want to get this one out of the way before we get ahead of ourselves. So look forward to that. I will be getting that stuff coming in the mail on Monday. Moving on to my 55. I used to call this my angelfish tank, but now we're just calling it my 55-gallon tank. Probably the least amount to talk about in this tank. It looks the crappiest. It's got that green cyanobacteria growing on everything. The plants really need to be worked on and trimmed back. I'm kind of gearing myself up for a revamp on this tank altogether. I want to redo the scape in the bottom. I want to add some more rocks or maybe put some more wood in there. I don't know. I want to remove a lot of this Java fern. Anubias. Cut that way back. If you look closely, you can actually see all through that Anubias. Somehow or another, I must have got some Java moss in there, and now it's growing like crazy. I know I brought some stuff back from the reservoir that was very similar to Java moss, and I had some of that in there, so maybe that's what's taken over and is getting a hold. But at any rate, I need to get in there and do some work on this tank. Again, it's my crappiest looking tank at the moment. Fish-wise, everything's going fine. I saw my little South American bumblebee catfish. It kind of lives in that little cave right there, but occasionally I will see it out and in the leaves, kind of hiding in the shadows within the Anubias itself. A lot of times it'll be out in the morning when I come down. So that's still alive and well. All my other diamond tetras, my hatchet fish, they're all still doing well. And then, of course, my green giant angelfish down here is still doing well, too. So whatever that stuff is what's growing all through my tank now. And I don't think that's Java moss, but I don't know. Kind of looks like it, but it also doesn't. So I'm not 100% sure what I've got growing all through this tank now. It's probably something I brought home and threw in there. That'd make about sense for maybe on brand. Anyway, that's all that's going on with this tank. So look forward to some work. I know, blah, blah, blah. I've been saying that forever. We'll get to this tank at some point. This is another tank that I've been talking about getting to at some point for a while, and I've started. I did do a big ChemiClean treatment, and again, from my regular viewers who are familiar with what this tank used to look like, it basically looked like somebody spilled a purple gallon of paint all over everything. It just had a layer, like a sheet of purple over everything. That red cyanobacteria just coated the entire tank. Everything except for a few of those rocks that the plecos I have in here were keeping clean. Other than that, everything in this tank was covered in that cyanobacteria, and now it looks like this. So I still need to get in there and do some work. It's interesting now that the leaves are exposed and they're getting light again. Look at all this new growth you're seeing. If you look around the tank and kind of get your eye in at what you're looking at, you'll see all this new growth is popping out everywhere on these plants, because I finally got them cleared off and you can see them again. The plecos are probably in there helping to clean up all that dead stuff. Let me move the light. I got actually two lights, and I got them both sitting back here so I can open the lid fully. So let's move the one back where it belongs. Get it up in the front of the tank. And then that gives us a much brighter appearance on the tank. So we will still be getting in here. I'm not going to change the tank around a lot, but we definitely need to thin out the plants and get that opened up a little bit. Again, I got plans for this tank. I got a few ideas of what I want to do fish wise. If it's any hint to anybody, I kind of want to get back to my roots on this tank and get back to my sort of original theme that I kind of started with on this tank. So there's a little hint for you of what direction we might be going there. So moving on to my 125 gallon New World tank. Not a lot actually going on with the tank specifically. Just did a big water change the other day, and the reason I did the water change was because I have been experimenting with putting some poultry grit in this tank as a additive to the substrate to alter the pH and raise my hardness a little bit. And again, poultry grit is another thing that we'll be talking about in an upcoming video. I'm not going to get into a bunch of detail about it right now, but long story short, poultry grit is basically crushed oyster shell, and there's some crushed aragonite coral in there as well. And that provides a good source of calcium carbonate, and we can talk about how rapidly it dissolves and how much it impacts your pH and so on and so forth in another video. But I was doing a little experiment with that. I had a small amount of it in the tank. I sort of watched over a week or so, maybe 10 days, watched to see what happened to the pH and to the hardness, and then I did a really big water change to see how much I altered all that kind of stuff. And I already did a video about that, so if you missed that and I remember, I will go ahead and put a card right there. You can check out that video if you want. But long story short is it didn't really do much, but it did what I wanted, and that was the important part. I wasn't trying to do much, and that was my goal, was to get it in there to have an impact but not radically change anything, and I was able to accomplish that. So again, we're going to be talking more about all of this stuff coming up in the future. While I was in there, I also removed some of the biomaterial I keep in the filter. This tank doesn't really need a whole lot of additional biofilter material, and I have a tray that has a big pouch full of ceramic rings in it, and I have another tray full of ceramic rings in it, and between the two of them, that's more than enough biofiltration for the whole tank. And then of course, when you factor in the fact that the tank itself has enough biofiltration, I don't need to overdo it with the filter. And I had a bunch of those pot scrubbies and some other stuff. I had the filter packed with biofiltration kind of material, so I took a bunch of that out. You can see how much more freely the water's flowing. I've got really good strong current now, and I put the entire top tray is completely open except for a pouch full of that oyster shell poultry grit. So we've got mostly oyster shell, but I've also got a little bit of aragonite in the filter, and that should be keeping my pH stable around 7.6, maybe 7.4, somewhere around in there. We'll see. And that's only, well, again, we'll get into this in some other videos. We'll have to wait and see how much the tannin production in this tank affects it, and how much the nitrate production in this affects it, because nitrate production actually lowers your pH, and that's going to counteract any buffer that I put in there, and so on and so forth. So anyway, long story short, make sure you're subscribed, and you won't miss all of those videos and discussions and experiments and so on and so forth coming up. But that's what's been going on here in my 125, despite the fact that I said not a lot was going on in there. My snail tank here, let me turn my perpetually running fan off. That just keeps the air moving around in the room and keeps it from getting all humid and stuffy. This water looks cloudy for a reason. That reason is I used garden lime to augment the water in this tank. I know that the snails aren't going to really be impacted by massive changes in water chemistry and so on and so forth. So this tank was one that I used to experiment with garden lime. I wanted to get dolomite lime because dolomite lime has magnesium and calcium carbonate in it, but all I found was regular old garden limestone. And when I put it in there, it's basically turns to like mud and clay. I did a few experiments in some other glasses of water and little jars of water and stuff in the other room, and every time I got muddy water that just doesn't clear up. As long as that substrate is in there, it just keeps being muddy water. So, and not the good kind of muddy waters. This is not the bad muddy waters. So I will be in there with a gravel vac at some point trying to get all that stuff out of there, and we'll put some clean water back in. And as you can see right there, I dumped a handful of that poultry grit in there instead. And so my snails are going to have good hard shells, plenty of calcium carbonate, rock solid pH, and so on and so forth. That's going to be a super, super stable tank. Plus that will act as substrate and allow for some more nitrifying bacteria to develop in the tank over time. So we're going to get that mud out of there. We're not going to be experimenting in any of my tanks with any more of that garden lime, but it was something to do. It was interesting and I learned from it, so that was all for the best. My 40-gallon native tank, likewise doing a little bit, not so much experimenting in this tank. I kind of know what's going to happen based on what I've done in my other tanks, but I did throw a little bit of that poultry grid in there. I threw it across the back, and yeah, you can kind of see a little bit of bright white right there. That is all just sand. I was doing something else with sand. I had a little bit left over, and rather than throw it in the trash, I just threw it in here. Over time, that'll get swept down into the little bits and pieces. Will fall down between the gravel. And I mean, frankly, you can barely notice it as it is. If it wasn't for what's sitting right here, and in fact, I could probably just do that, and most of that'll be gone next time you look at the tank. So anyway, that's why I'm not too worried about the sand. Just the fish swimming around, the crayfish kicking its fin, and that sort of thing will eventually get that sand all dispersed, and you won't even be able to see it. So the sand has nothing to do with anything, but I did put some of that poultry grid in there, and I did put some eggshells in there. So my crayfish sloughed recently. He sloughed not long after putting the poultry grid in there, and also putting the eggshells in there. And so I got a good successful slough. The crayfish itself is not, and we were just trying to look at it. I saw it walk past, but I don't know if that actually came out on camera. And again, I apologize for the tanks being a little on the messy side. The glass is not entirely clean, but this is a very impromptu video. I just wanted to show everybody what's going on in the fish room right now, Saturday afternoon. And once we get this out of the way, we can go ahead and do, you know, other stuff and other videos and whatnot. But anyway, the crayfish sloughed, looks really good. He did not get that much bigger in its body. It's getting pretty close to being a full-grown crayfish. It's not going to grow too much more in that sense, but its claws got a lot bigger. So its claws almost doubled in size. It almost looks like a Popeye type crayfish now. It has these ridiculously huge forearms on these little stalks of claws, and the body itself almost looks disproportionately small now. So at some point, we will get a look at the crayfish. As you know, sorry he didn't come out during this video, but that's how it goes sometimes. But next time you get to see the crayfish, you will get to see those giant Popeye claws, and they're really nice and blue too. They really colored up nicely during this molting process. Java fern up here, I mean, water sprite up here is still doing okay, but it's getting a little bit burnt up being directly under the light like that. And then of course I need to get in here and get some of that duckweed cleared off the surface. Getting a lot of new growth and little young ones starting to grow here on my water sprite too. This is all part of the same plant. So moving on to my 125-gallon tank, we need to come around the waterfall and over here in order to get the whole thing in one shot. So not much to talk about in this tank that's going on at the moment. I kind of need to get in there and do a water change. You can see how the end on the left there almost looks cloudy. That's not cloudiness. It's really, really bright reflected light coming off of that white rock in there. And then of course we're seeing it come through all that green algae that's growing on the glass, and that gives it the appearance of being very sort of cloudy water. But if we look at the water itself, it's not at all. So I've got new fish that are going to be going in this tank, but we'll get to them when we get to the quarantine tank, because that's where they are right now. Otherwise, everything is still just kind of rolling along, ticking over. This is one of my more heavily stocked tanks. I do feed this tank a lot. It's got plecos on the bottom that we can't even see in this video, so there's a lot going on in this tank, and as such I generally have a lot of maintenance and cleanup. So we do need to get in there, and you can see all this crud that's being collected. I kind of keep these little pockets here as traps for collecting this stuff. It makes it easy to vac out of there. I've been asked before, why don't I just move the vac around the tank? Why don't, you know, rather than I stir all the stuff up and let it flow down to this end of the tank, and I just work the vac at this end of the tank. And I've been asked, why don't I just take the vac and move down the tank? And the reason is most of that detritus and stuff gets caught under things. You know, I'm trying to work the stuff out from under all this stuff. I'm trying to move it down. I've got the braces here, so moving the vac around is not always easy. You can't just move it down the length of the tank. And of course, I've got all the roots in the substrate, so I can't really crunch the vac down into the substrate or get it into these little nooks and crannies. It's just easier to leave the vac at that end and brush everything down to it. You can think of it as like a central vac in a house, where you just sweep everything to where the vac is and let the vac pick it up as you sweep it in. And so I kind of do the same thing in this tank, and that's why I do it that way. So that's a little look at my Tenopoma. That fish right there would be a big enough bio load on this tank by itself. It's thick as a brick and about 7 inches long. I've got a rainbow shark back there you just got a little glimpse of. And of course, I've also got that green cyanobacteria in this tank. I've got that in all my tanks, at least to some degree and somewhere. So I recently cut back my, whatever this stuff is called, red tiger lotus. It's doing really well. It's coming back. We got new growth down at the bottom. Everything's looking good. And again, not much to talk about. I haven't really done much on this tank this week. But we are due for some maintenance on this one, so you can look forward to another water change video coming up on this one here pretty soon. Moving on to my 20-gallon angelfish tank. This tank is now down to one clown pleco that lives underneath that rock on the left side of the screen. I've got the angelfish, which is my German blue. I've had him for 5 or 6 years now, maybe longer than that. I don't know. It's been a long time since I've had that fish. And I've got the one cherry barb in here. She recently jumped out of the tank. I was able to rescue her, barely, but I did rescue her and put her in the quarantine tank. And after she recovered and everything, she's made her way back in. And now, at least as of this morning, she was still in there and swimming around and looking fine, but I don't see her at all anymore. But that's just the point. This tank is really, really low on its stocking density. I'm working on kind of building my tanks back up. Again, with all the craziness over the last year or so, I haven't been going out and been visiting fish stores very much. And so hopefully in the near future, things will be sort of easing back into some kind of normality, and I'll be getting to the fish store a little more frequently, and we're going to get some of these tanks stocked back up. So not much going on in here, not been doing any experimenting. I will say though, after my last stint with the ChemiClean and that whole treatment, my regular viewers remember I blasted this tank and really just hit the ChemiClean hard into this tank, and we still haven't had a lot of stuff coming back. I do have this green growth. Not really sure what that is because it doesn't look like cyanobacteria. I do have the red or the orange cyanobacteria, whatever you want to call that stuff, red cyanobacteria. I don't care about that. That doesn't bother me. It was that green stuff that was coating everything that looked awful, and it's just not coming back. So I'm definitely happy about that. I do have, again, more of this green stuff. It just looks like some kind of green algae or something growing on the bottom. Not worried about that. That's not a concern of mine. That green stuff that just sheeted and grew all over like in mats and sheets in this tank is what I wanted to get out of here, and I apparently did. So yay, I'm happy about that. My quarantine tank is currently holding one Synodontis. I don't know how it's pronounced. I've seen it. It's spelled Eupterus. It's got a P in there. E-U-P-T-E-R-U-S. So I don't know if it's Eupterus or Euterus. I don't know if it's a silent P. But you can get them as African featherfin squeakers. Sometimes they are sold as lace catfish. But it is a Synodontis. I'm going to say Eupterus. I'm going to pronounce the P because I can see it. I heard somewhere recently that you can always tell the difference between people that read a lot versus that talk a lot or listen a lot, because people that read a lot mispronounce words all the time, and that's true because I see them written all the time. I don't hear people saying them. I actually see them, so I don't know how other people say them. And so you're going to get my interpretation of that a lot of times. So there you go. I also bought 2 Siamese algae eaters, not to be confused with Chinese algae eaters, which are awful fish. These are Siamese algae eaters, which are fantastic fish, and they are also not to be confused with flying foxes. So we'll talk more about that coming up in another video when we talk about them going into their tank. My 40-gallon, still calling it my Brackish tank, or we can call it Butterbeans tank, whatever you want to call it. Nothing to talk about in this one other than we really still need to get in there and vac out all the dead snail shells and just do a basic water change. Probably wouldn't hurt to do a chemi-clean treatment on this tank too. You can see the red cyanobacteria growing on things, but it always does, it always has. It never really gets too out of control. When I do a water change, I will physically remove some of that stuff just by vacuuming it out of there. I don't use a gravel vac, I use a regular standard siphon hose, and you get far more vigorous suction when you use a siphon hose as opposed to the gravel vac. And I can actually just rip a lot of that stuff right off of the rocks and then tear it off of the surface of the leaves. I am getting a lot better growth now that I've reduced the salinity in this tank. It's no longer actually brackish. We're sitting just below what would be considered brackish as far as the salinity. And as such, or as a result, my Java fern really seems to be recovering. It was barely hanging on after all these years in that salty brackish water. And now it is actually starting to turn green again. And Butterbean's doing a lot better. So I'm rethinking my idea that these figure 8 puffers need to be in brackish water. I've told so many people over the years that you really need to keep these puffers in brackish water, and I don't believe that to be the case at all. I think in fact quite the opposite. If they're kept in brackish water consistently over the long term, it's not good for them. Butterbean had all sorts of lesions and weird marks and stuff all over his skin, and the more I reduced his salinity, the better he's gotten. And now you can barely tell he ever had anything wrong with him, and we're down to like 1.002 on the brackish scale, or on the salinity specific gravity scale. So putting some dissolved minerals in there, putting some marine salts in the water is probably good for them, but I don't think it should be consistently kept at a level that would be considered brackish water. It should be just below that, and that's been my experience so far. So we'll shoot a video talking about that too. I'll put that on my list of all the other million videos I want to shoot. So again, make sure you're subscribed and you won't miss any of that. And there's my other camera standing by on its tripod. And we're back to where we started, more or less. We're going to not jump back to the waterfall tank just yet. And we're going to say thanks for watching. Make sure you're subscribed. As I keep saying, you don't want to miss anything I got coming up. You never know what it's going to be with me. So thanks again. Hope you enjoyed that little trip around the world. Don't forget, this one is my 29 Miscellaneous. And I will see you real soon on the next one.